Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I am your host, Mike DiGirolamo, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's frontline, filling in for your regular host, Mike Gaurecki, who, you will be pleased to know, will be returning as your newscast host on the next episode. So, welcome back, Mike. It's been a privilege hosting the show while you've been gone. Joining us this week is Goldman Environmental Prize winner Claire Nouvian, who, through years of advocacy, along with her organization, the Bloom Association, ushered in French support for a ban on the destructive fishing practice of bottom trawling, which later resulted in an EU-wide ban on the practice. Claire talks to us about the recent news that the European Commission will ban the practice in 16,000 square kilometers in the North Atlantic Ocean, building upon the Deep Sea Access Regulation, which was adopted by the European Commission in 2016. Claire discusses the importance of deep-sea biodiversity and massive cold-water coral reef ecosystems, sea pens, and deep-sea sponges. Ecosystems that allow fish to reproduce, thereby supporting marine life and livelihoods of people across the world, and of course are critical in the fight against climate change. She explains how the destructive practice of bottom trawling literally scrapes these ecosystems off the seafloor, quickly obliterating them for comparatively diminutive fish catch and tossing the dead marine life back into the ocean. She covers not just the need to ban the practice, but the need to embolden and support small-scale and sustainable fisheries. She shares her thoughts on how Bloom has achieved conservation wins years in the making and her advice to anyone who advocates for positive change. Hi, Claire. Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. How are you?
I'm good. Yourself?
I'm doing great. So first, can you please explain what bottom trawling is and why it's so destructive?
Bottom trawling is a very destructive fishing technique because there are big nets which are towed along the seafloor, so they scrape things that live on the seafloor, sessile animals like sponges or corals or plants or whatever, and all animals. So they're very destructive to habitats. They're also unselective. It's impossible to be selective with such gears because you just pick up everything that's in your way. And of course, in order to tow this gear, which is, very heavy, especially in deep sea bottom trawling cases, you're trawling at, hundreds of meters of depth. And so it's very heavy. And in order to do that, you need to have seriously powerful engines. And therefore, you're using a lot of fuel and you emit a lot of CO2 on top of disturbing the sediments, which store carbon. So really, you could not have more flaws combined in one gear.
And it's difficult for our audience to see what this looks like because it's at the bottom of the ocean, but can you paint a picture of what deep water biodiversity looks like and why it's so important?
Well, it's very difficult to do that because this is just as if you were asking somebody, can you paint a picture of what the Earth looks like? All terrestrial habitats, right? You wouldn't be able to do that because some areas do look like pine forests and others are like marshlands and others are mangroves. And then there's other places where there are cities. And if you think of a deep sea coral reef, for example, or a coral reef, you would be closer to a city sort of analogy than anything else, right? Because a coral reef is a bunch of animals, lots of different species that have been interacting physically, not just biologically, to produce stories. Basically these are buildings with stories. With you would have hospitals and nurseries and schools and there's so much life going on. It's all intricate and complex, right? And so that's what happens with corals or sponge beds but then there are other areas which are more like mud flats, as we call them. But even mud flats have lots of little creatures that live in the sediment and above the sediment that contribute to marine biodiversity, to a huge amount of different species, and also to storing carbon, right? So there's lots of different ecosystems in the deep sea, especially in the ocean in general, and the deep sea specifically.
And can you explain to our audience what this bottom trawling fishing gear looks like while it's in action and how it wipes out biodiversity?
Yeah, well, the fishing nets are usually really massive. It's very difficult to picture this, right? Because when you see a fishing vessel on top of the ocean, it's really hard to fathom that actually it is deploying massive nets below the surface of the water, right? And these nets are, in order to stay on the seafloor, they're weighted. So they have either rollers or some sort of, there used to be rock hopper gear. So they were really bad, large, heavy instruments or metal pieces with doors, large metal doors that keep the nets open. So you're really throwing massive gear down there, which should be used to wipe out something, but certainly not to fish anything alive, right? So if you wanted to destroy something, that's probably a good idea. But if you want to actually sustainably harvest something which is alive and you depend on that resource to remain healthy, that really is a bad idea.
So how much fish is actually gained from this process versus how much biodiversity it's wiping out?
This is a really depressing part. Deep sea bottom trawlers in general, we found some figures that show that for about 100 species that they would really impact over a year, there's about 3 that are marketed, which sort of make their way to a fishmonger's stall or something. So for 3 species that you actually market, there are about 100 species that you throw overboard. And then I have to add that those 3 species used to be, discarded before because they're really not very good. So it's not a good idea to go fish down there because the fish are not good. The operations are supported financially by public subsidies. And overall, we found that deep sea bottom trawling was making a loss despite public subsidies. So there's not even a big profit to be made, or sometimes they're just straight financial losses. But those that operate deep sea vessels are usually paired or coupled with those companies that have access to markets. So they will make the profit bottom at the end of the day, but their fishing operations on their own are not profitable. So if you were a fisher alone, you would not go fish in the deep sea. You would not be able to do it, despite public subsidies, right? Despite a huge financial incentive provided by public authorities. So these are operations which are purely industrial. They cannot be fishing in the sense that we hear fishing, right? When you talk to somebody on the street and you say, "What's a fisherman for you?" They will tell you somebody that goes with a boat, fishes for the day, comes back, right? Somebody who has a family business, probably something that, he inherited from a father or an uncle or something, right? Now, we're not talking about this. We're talking about large industrial vessels that go out there, wipe out a resource, destroy habitats, destroy carbon, destroy the climate, biodiversity with public money just to make money for retailers in general. So it's just wrong. It's not just wrong from an ecological point of view. It's really wrong from an ethical point of view.
So can you tell our listeners about your advocacy and how this led to French support for a ban on bottom trawling?
Well, it took us 7 years at Bloom in Paris to really mount such public pressure on the French government and on French deep sea trawlers that at the end of the day they had to accept, caving in to public pressure and accepting a deep sea regulation in which we had a bottom trawl ban below 800 meters. It took that much effort because there was determination from the French government and French industrial fleets to keep on ravaging the deep sea. They were completely aligned. And that's usually what we find in France. We're really a bad country when it comes to fishing. I mean, our industrial fleets don't behave well. And our authorities just completely stick with what the industrial lobbies ask them to support at European or national level. So for years, we had a government, actually successive governments, that were completely supportive of the deep sea trawl industry asks. And we really plunged into the matter, like the dossier altogether. And we found what I was telling you about deep sea bottom trawling subsidies. We had no idea, but then we bought the accounts of the fishing fleets that were fishing down there. We wanted to see how they performed, right, economically. And we're stunned to find that they're actually not even making a profit despite subsidies. And these fleets had told us, and actually they had told European institutions bluntly in their face that they were not subsidized. And they had been lying. So we wanted to see also whether they were lying or not. So we bought the accounts. In order to get the accounts, we had to sue them in court. We had to, threaten them with litigation and so on. And then we got the accounts, and then we're able to establish that they were lying. They had gotten subsidies and they were unprofitable. So I think part of all the things that we did, I think the subsidy approach to this, the financial performance of these fleets on top of their ecological destruction, I think that really is what made us win at the end of the day. Massive support from the French public and the French citizens that went berserk, literally, on the retailer, because the one fleet that was operating, the largest deep sea bottom trawl fleet, was actually a fleet belonging to a retailer which is very well known in France, called Intermarché. And so it's not as if the fleet name was unknown to people, it's a bit like Monsanto nowadays. I mean, Monsanto has now become a big name. We all know how Monsanto acts and so on, but Monsanto does not have a shop, right? You don't go into a Monsanto to buy stuff. And so we were actually quite lucky that retailer was the one that was most implicated in deep sea bottom trawling, because it resonated immediately with the French public. And so it was funny because it took us many years of research, of collaboration with scientists, of releasing information, precise information on the damage that these fleets were doing. The whole typical things, suite of things that you would do when you're running a campaign, right? And at the end of the day, we posted a petition to our president then to ask France to completely stop supporting deep sea fleets and to protect the ocean, the climate, and diversity instead. And a French illustrator produced a little comic strip. And I remember I was in the European Parliament in Strasbourg at that time, when she published her little comic strip online. And we had 10,000 signatories to our petition by the time she published her little cartoon thing. And it flew to 1 million signatures, to such an extent that actually our provider completely crashed because we hadn't paid for such bandwidth, So we lost about 200,000 signatures, but so it became like the most signed on petition in France, in French history at that time. So I think that also put a lot of pressure just before the plenary vote in the European Parliament. But that alone, that was in 2013, and that alone did not suffice to get the French government on board. I mean, it really took another 3 years to get things done. So no, it's been very long and tedious. But I mean, the one lesson to learn from this, and for anyone who wants to get a change in real life, is to never let go. To never, ever, ever let go. And just to be perseverant until you win. It's just a matter of time.
And where do fish that are scraped from the seafloor end up in markets? Where are people buying these fish?
Deep sea fish are such a minute proportion of the catch in Europe that you wouldn't even see a lot of them on actually fishmonger sections, right? So if you wanted deep sea fish, you would have a hard time finding them. You would have to go to that retailer, Intermarché, for example. They have deep sea fish, but they're less than 1% of the catch. So they're really not even that common. And actually, they're not good. So you don't really want to eat them anyway. We're talking about fish that used to be called, for example, one of them is called rat tail. So they had to rename them because nobody wants to eat rat tail, right? So they renamed them like grenadier, They gave them some sort of shiny names so that people would forget that they're actually very, very thin and skinny and adapted to life in the deep, dark waters, So they have very long, thin tails. They don't have a lot of flesh. They have large heads, huge eyes. You really don't want to be eating them if you see them. So they cut their head off, they fillet them, and then they place them on markets with cool names. But that's just to hide the hideous nature of the catch.
What would you tell our listeners to do if they wanted to avoid buying fish that come from bottom trawling, either in the EU or anywhere else in the world?
I would tell anyone with an ecological consciousness at this stage to stop buying fish that come from bottom trawling altogether. from anywhere. Bottom trawling, whether you have Chinese trawlers, for example, right now in Madagascar waters, they're destroying Madagascar inshore waters and therefore inshore fisheries. And domestic artisanal fisheries really don't need that, right? I mean, Madagascar is under, and the whole of the African coast is undergoing already the crisis. You know, they have the climate change is hitting them hard and hardest. I mean, the last thing they need is our industrial fleets, whether from China or Korea or Spain or France or whatnot, to go over there and actually destroy their habitats. So definitely choosing to avoid a gear type is the easiest way to choose sustainable fish at this stage. Because if you're supposed to learn off by heart a whole list of species and then recognize them, remember them, and then remember when they breed, when not, I mean, you're never going to be able to really select sustainable seafood, right? So you can either use guides like Seafood Watch if you live in the US, but if you don't have that available, then really just steer clear from all bottom trawling. Also, we found that bottom trawlers, those that we've been interacting with, these industrial players, they don't just destroy, public finance, the environment. Their ways are wrong for democracy. So they are destructive of democratic processes. They need opacity to operate. That's why there's no transparency around their operations. There's very little transparency about their finance, the way they manage to get the quotas, their influence of political processes. I mean, there's a lot of wrongdoing from also a democratic point of view.
And can you tell us where bottom trawling is being practiced currently?
Oh, everywhere around the world. Everywhere around the world. It's not the most. This is absolutely not the most important gear type, but it is the most destructive and the one that produces large turnovers. So they can, they can catch a lot of volume for cheap quantity, and that's what the industry wants. If you want to put fish on a processing chain, you want typically retailers work really well with bottom trawlers because retailers, they want large volumes at cheap prices, and that's exactly what bottom trawling provides them with. Cheap quality, cheap prices for sort of industrial chains. But if you want, positive impact socially and ecologically, that's the last gear type that you should be buying.
So we've mentioned your organization, Bloom. Can you talk a bit more about what it is your organization does?
Bloom is science-based NGO. We're based in Paris and we have an office in Hong Kong as well. We work a lot out of Brussels. We work to shed light on scientific processes which are not addressed by public research. So typically we spend a lot of time looking at the performance from a financial point of view of fleets. We then use the data, and that's where we're not a research institute alone, right? We're not just doing research for the sake of research. We use the research that we produce in order to transform reality. We like changes, we like results, we like efficiency, and we want to see a change in the water, and we want to see a change in the fishing sector before 2030. So we use the data that we collect and produce by taking it all the way into either political processes or into judicial processes. We take court actions, we litigate, we mobilize citizens, media, we do the whole chain. And the third thing that makes us, I think, a bit special is that we never, ever let go of a problem. And that's one of the reasons why people really like us, is because they know that we can be talking about the same thing for literally 18 years, but never with the same angle, right? Because typically the deep sea bottom trawl issue, we started a long time ago. It took us 7 years to get a clear win in the European Parliament and Council and Commission. But then it was not the end of the problems, right? Because then there's implementation. And so we're also doing the follow-up with the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition that we partner with, and we're a member of the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition. And so we've done everything with them to make sure that we follow through. We give hope to people, although we don't have much hope, but we don't act out of hope. We think we don't need hope to act. We just think that, we're in a deep mess. Our whole economic models are based on the destruction of biodiversity and the climate. And we all know that we have to transition away from that. So we're just taking one problem after another and just going until there is a change in policies, in procurement policies of our retailers, in consumption habits, in media awareness, the whole thing. And we just never, it's a never ending game, right?
So now that the EU has limited bottom trawling in 16,000 square kilometers of the Atlantic, what are the effects of this, and what is Bloom's next big ask? What would you like to see happen next?
What happened in 2016 when we eventually won a new deep sea regulation in Europe? What happened in the 2016 regulation is that we managed to get, because we put so much pressure on the whole chain of producers, of the retailers and so on, we managed to get in the regulation a bottom trawling prohibition below 800 meters, right? So the prohibition is only for bottom trawlers below 800 meters. But actually, everybody knew that 800 meters was way too deep to really protect vulnerable marine ecosystems like deep sea coral beds or sponge beds, etc. So there was another piece of Article 9 in the regulation, which said that within 2 years, the European Commission should close vulnerable marine ecosystems, beautiful ecosystems, extraordinary ecosystems, below 400 meters. So the European Commission had 2 years to take what's called an implementing act to close those areas which are absolutely formidable, extraordinary, great for corals and marine life. They had 2 years to close those vulnerable marine ecosystems below 400 meters for all gears that touch the bottom. So there was a prohibition for bottom trawling below 800 meters and a closure of marine ecosystems which are vulnerable below 400 meters, but to all bottom fishing gears, not just bottom trawling. So the European Commission didn't let go of its obligation to close those vulnerable marine ecosystems, and the Commission actually moved on and closed those areas. But in the meantime, the fishing industry from Spain and France has threatened the Commission with litigation if it actually moved on and closed those areas. And they've been really repeating this in the public space, saying that they would litigate, that they're thinking of how to take the European Commission to court. So that's one of the things that they're doing, right? They're threatening with litigation. So we have to keep an eye on this. And on the second thing that they're doing, the fishing industry, as always, is pairing with the worst member states in Europe when it comes to industrial fishing, which is, France and Spain, as usual. And the French and Spanish governments are now questioning the value of science that was behind those closures. They're providing all these elements of language where you can see that their plan is to derail the protection and to reopen some of these areas to fishing. So really, when I was saying that, this is a never-ending game, really, it never ends. I mean, we're going to have to be very vigilant and make sure that the governments, which are acting in a very unacceptable way by echoing just precisely like little faithful little puppies, they're just echoing exactly what the industrial fishing fleets are asking them to echo. And that is not acceptable because the ocean needs the protection and the determination of states to be, doing what they're supposed to do, provide great diversity of life, biomass of living organisms so that we can have carbon storage. The emissions of CO2 can be stored by the ocean because there are things that live in the ocean. You're not going to be able to have like a carbon pump, which actually works in the ocean if you empty the ocean and put it under so much stress, right? And So it's shocking to see that we have governments right now in France and Spain which are acting like 20th century governments. It's like they really did not get the plot. They're completely behind the expectations of not just IPCC or IPBES scientists, but every single citizen now, right? We don't want their fish. If that's what it takes to get, to break the climate, to break ecosystems, if that's what it takes to have fish on our plate, then you know what? Thank you. Keep your fish to yourselves. Maybe we should just use the money that goes into these industrial fleets anyway to pay them to stay at port, right? And do other things in life. Maybe actually go and protect the ocean for that matter.
Considering bottom trawling brings in around 25% of the global wild fish harvest, what do you say to people who argue we'll never be able to get enough seafood to feed people without bottom trawling?
Well, there's bottom trawling and deep sea bottom trawling. For deep sea bottom trawling, of course, the catch is minute, so it's irrelevant. It doesn't even exist in terms of food safety at all. And for the other part, so it's only 25%, which is not the majority, as you can see. And the thing is, for small scale bottom trawlers that work in inshore waters, etc. Definitely, those are family businesses. They're not large industrial corporations that practice, fiscal evasion or whatnot. When you're talking about family businesses and so on, really what you should expect from governments, you should expect governments to actually start a plan to tell them, all right, you're not just destructive for all the good reasons we know. You're also under stress because fuel is becoming scarce, because there's war in Ukraine because of the Russian invasion, and because you're stuck. Your model is so fuel intensive, it's not going to work for the future. And everybody's known this, right? It's been written in every single scientific report and even political reports for decades. But nobody has had the guts to resist the pressure from the troll lobby and to tell them, you know what? We're going to make you shift. And we have enough money, right? We have enough public money to actually make you shift away from such a destructive model, which is going to get you guys stuck somewhere, which is really not where you want to be. And this is exactly where they are now. European fisheries, all of a sudden, you have war with Russia and Ukraine, fuel prices are going up, and these guys are stuck just because public authorities have not had the courage and intelligence to actually start planning how they're going to transition away from such, high fuel intensive and destructive gear. So I think everything is a matter of planning. I think fishers are very aware that their model is not going to work in the future. But of course, nobody wants to create, jobless situations which are desperate in ports. Nobody wants that. So it's really a matter of sitting down with people and seeing where some of the gears which are today bottom trawling, some of this gear, how can it shift to more selective gear, which are less fuel intensive? And they have a lot of ideas. If you ask fishers, they have a lot of ideas. And actually, if you ask them, there are probably a lot of them that are happy to stop fishing for that matter, So I think there's lots of solutions. We do have a problem with too much fishing effort worldwide anyway. There's definitely too many boats which are being way too efficient at catching fish. And if we want to fish more in the future, we have to start by decreasing the pressure on fish resources right now. And it's as simple as that. Anybody in junior high school would understand that. It really does. It's not a complex maths, right? But we do need to reduce the fishing pressure. And because we need to do it anyway, we might as well start with the most destructive gear, right?
And so what would you say to the Spanish Fishing Confederation that the European Commission's decision would have devastating consequences to the fishing industry?
We've heard the statements from the fishing industry that anything that ever changes always has massive impacts. It's as if, the whole of Spain is going to go jobless, So these exaggerations to start with, we're very used to, and they don't scare us anymore. And the second thing is, if it were true, then let's talk. But you know what? In order to know whether it's true or not, we would like to have access to data, because there is nothing which is public. So if they want to have a serious conversation, then they should produce their logbooks with all the information on the catch, the species, and then we can compare what value, what jobs are created, where, so we can have a decent, rational, scientific conversation about this. And then once we have the scientific statement before us, if we can have access to data, then it becomes a political decision. How do we operate, or let's say, how do we launch a public debate to know what type of fishing we want as citizens, what kind of asks we have to the fishing industry so that it transforms its operations to match our expectations and the expectations of the climate, the imperatives of the climate and biodiversity crisis, right? So I think everything can be transformed. It's just a matter of being really sincere in the process. Any kind of public process or conversation with that sincerity of the actors leads nowhere. And when you have so much bad faith, when you have just litigation threats, when you have exaggerations, threats, it doesn't lead us anywhere. It's been impossible to have a decent conversation with the industry. It's not responsible. It's not acting responsibly right now.
And just to summarize, what do we stand to lose if we lose this delicate marine life?
Well, there's two ways to look at this, right? There's one way which is ethical. You would say there is an intrinsic value to species which have formed over millions of years. And there is no ethical justification for one species, human beings, to wipe out other species. And then there's lots of other justifications. I think the intrinsic value of diversity of life on Earth in itself, to me, as a person, is enough. But then if you wanted to corroborate your point, or if you wanted to persuade someone that really is not in line with that kind of ethical take, then you should at least look at this from an economic and climate perspective. Fish in the water, especially in the deep sea, are worth more than fish on your plate. Deep sea fisheries are economically unprofitable because we throw public money in the plate, right? So there's a scientist, Clive Truman, that had looked just at what was going on in terms of deep sea fishing off the Irish and UK coast. And he had found that, just those deep sea fish there stored 1 million tons of CO2 every year. So just for that climate value, you should keep them over there on the continental shelf, instead of bringing them up with all the consumption of fuel, with all the damage, just to eat really not very good fish, So at the end of the day, it makes more rational sense to keep the biggest biomass of fish possible in the water.
Are there any bottom trawling related stories that you think Mongabay should look into?
Yeah, I think you should. Actually, I've been crying in the desert about something that I think media should investigate, and that is the power of influence of industrial lobbies. We have a real problem with opacity. Industrial lobbies are obviously all over the place. They produce elements of language which are literally copied, pasted into the discourse of public authorities, presidents of the republic, ministers, MEPs, members of the European Parliament and so on. I have a huge problem with this. And I know that citizens have a huge democratic problem with this because there is no traceability, no accountability of their power of influence to actually steer the public decision where there is no rational justification to make the choices that public authorities are actually supporting. If we had a rational conversation about this with citizens and fair, sincere politicians, we obviously would not be choosing to support industrial fleets like we do. We would be supporting those that provide 80% of the jobs in the fishing sector, and that would be small-scale fishers, which use passive gear, which have selective gear, produce jobs all along the coastline, could produce more fish if they were given access to quota. But the fishing quotas are completely absorbed by the industrial fleets. And the reason why they have access to quotas is because they are supported by politicians. So fisheries is a pure political problem, because we're talking about a common resource, fish, in a common space, the ocean, with common resources from a financial point of view, which is public subsidies. So everything, if you want to go and fish, you rely on a public decision to get your fishing license, your fishing quota, your fishing zone. Everything is public. Everything is political. And so the number one problem we have with fisheries is politics. So we need transparency, and therefore We need investigations. Please go ahead and ask for accreditation to follow closely what's happening in the December quota meeting between the fisheries ministers of the whole of the EU. You'll see what happens with your own eyes. The first thing, you will probably not be given the access to the negotiations when the fishing lobbies do have access to the negotiations. So, yeah, we need reports on what's happening in terms of influence. It's very negative.
Claire, thanks so much for chatting with us. It's been great having you on the show.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very glad that you gave us an opportunity to shed some light on some of the pathetic attitudes of the French government or Spanish government. So thanks.
You can read more on Mongabay's recent reporting on the European Commission's decision by visiting mongabay.com and searching for our Oceans series, or reading Claire Elizabeth Albert's recent piece, which is linked in the show notes. As always, if you enjoyed the Mongabay Newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. It is the best way to help expand our reach and keep growing. You can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a non-profit news outlet, and so even just $1 per month will really help us offset the production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay Newscast. That's patreon.com/Mongabay. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay Newscast nearly 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either App Store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all our previous episodes. And yes, of course, you can always read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, give us a follow at facebook.com/Mongabay, or on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, where our handle is @Mongabay on all platforms. Thanks for listening, and while I won't see you again next time, you can hear my latest reporting on Mongabay's sister podcast series, Mongabay Explores, which you can find on all major podcast platforms. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.